By default, the best way to work with your text is to use what's called align left. That's exactly what we have here. Align left gives us a nice even line on the left side and a ragged line on the right side. And to do that, you can just choose this option in the paragraph panel, which is the default. And this is a really good way to work. It's what's recommended in most cases. But there are some situations where you might want to have a flush line on both the left and the right. So in order to do that, you can use what's called justify, and this is the option you want in order to do that. And you want this first one because that's going to leave the last line of the paragraph justified to the left, whereas if you choose one of these other options, it's going to do some kind of other weird things with those lines. So in general, this is the one you want. The big downside to using justified text is that it creates major compromises in the typesetting. So you can see that when I switch this between left align and justify, it's having to add a ton of extra space to some of these words in order to get this to line up perfectly on the right side. And the problem with this is it ends up really affecting the reading experience and creating what are called rivers. So you can see that there are like these big gaps, and those gaps, that white space really jumps out at you when they kind of line up, and that's what's called a river. And you can see some rivers kind of running through here. Those are really unsightly, and like I said, they really draw the attention of the reader rather than pulling them into the text. So it's one of the reasons why we tend to avoid justifying our type. That being said, it's not wrong to use justified type, it just takes a little bit more work, because as the designer, when you choose to use justified text, it's on you to make sure that it's readable and that there are no rivers in it. So I want to show you a few techniques to make your justified text look a little bit better. First of all, a couple sort of rules of thumb. In general, justified text is going to look better when you have more characters per line. So if you have really, really tight columns, like if I narrow this up a whole bunch, okay, and then I compare that to a wider column of text, you'll notice that this feels a little bit more even, whereas the tighter column of text has insanely large rivers because InDesign doesn't know what to do. It has to, make, some lines work with just a few letters and others with a lot more letters. So in some cases, it's sort of squishing everything in. In other cases, it's really spacing things out and creating huge problems. Whereas the wider column of text with more characters per line, there's just a little bit more leeway for InDesign to work because the range of characters isn't as large. So in general, larger line lengths are going to work a little bit better with justified type. Another thing to consider is hyphenation. Okay, so hyphenation is something that is another compromise, and it's another compromise between even letter spacing and having a sort of compromised word construction. So hyphenation, what it does is it takes really long words and it'll actually hyphenate it and break it into two lines. So for instance, if I go ahead and select these two paragraph text blocks and go to the paragraph panel and check on hyphenate, okay, you'll see that when I check that on and off, it improves the letter spacing a little bit, especially on this one, because it's giving InDesign a slightly better option when it's faced with really long words to be able to split it into two lines, and that's reducing some of those rivers. So a lot of times when we're using the regular left align, we choose not to hyphenate, or we change the settings so that the hyphenation is really minimal. But usually when we choose the full justification with an even flush side on both the left and the right, that's when we break down and choose to add in that hyphenation, because since we're already taking some compromises with the word spacing, the hyphenation is going to help that along a bit. Okay, and then the last tip is something that a lot of people don't know about, but there's actually some different rules that you can give InDesign for the way this justification is handled. Okay, so let me delete this wider column and let's just use a regular column, kind of a normal width. Okay, and this is what it looks like with just hyphenation turned on. Let's go ahead and select this, and in this little drop down menu next to the paragraph panel, okay, we're going to go down to justification. Okay, this is going to open up a separate window, and these are the different rules that InDesign uses in order to decide how the justification is applied. There's something in InDesign called the paragraph composer, And the paragraph composer is responsible for making all these decisions. So here, in this dialog, we're able to communicate with that paragraph composer and give it a little bit more information about how we want it to work. Okay, so I'm going to check preview on so we can see the changes we're making reflected in what's going on. And yeah, let's go ahead and look at some of these different options. So you'll see by default, word spacing, is set to 100% for desired, and a minimum of 80% with a maximum of 133%. So basically what this means is that InDesign is going to, in some cases, condense the space between words to 80% of what is normal, and in some cases expand the space between words to 133% what is normal. And it's going to shoot for 100%, which makes sense because we want it to be normal if at all possible. Okay, and that's the only thing that InDesign is allowed to do. But using letter spacing and glyph scaling, we can give it a few more sort of factors that it can change to make that spacing a little bit more even. Okay, so letter spacing is going to do something really similar to word spacing, but instead of just changing the space between words, it's also going to change the tracking of specific lines. So a line that's really tight, it can track in the letters a little bit closer together, and a line that's really loose, it can track out the letters a little bit as well. Okay, so for the letter spacing, let's go to minimum of -5. You can already see that that's starting to make a difference because it's able to track certain letters in, it's giving it a little bit more leeway. And then for letter spacing maximum, let's go out to +5. And these aren't necessarily the best values to put in here, but definitely some things to play around with to get you the result that you want. Okay, glyph scaling is another factor that InDesign can use. Basically what it does is it literally changes the point size of the type for a specific line. So for instance, if you're using 10-point type, if I go down to 98% glyph scaling for the minimum, it's basically going to make some of the lines of type 9.8 points instead of 10 points. Okay, and same with the maximum. If I go up to 103, then some of the lines are going to go up to 10.3 points, whereas other lines are going to be 9.8 points. So the idea here is that these adjustments are so minor that you're probably not going to be able to detect it with your eyes, but it's going to allow InDesign to create those nice even lines. Okay, let's also change the word spacing because I always think that this default is a little too extreme. So let's take the maximum down to 120 so we don't get those huge spaces. And the minimum, let's set that to 85%. Okay, and then I'm just going to check preview on and off. And you can see that, with it off, we do have some pretty extreme word spaces here. Like if you look at the space between this word, okay, and then you go down to this line and look at the space between these words, this is really tight compared to this. But when I check preview on, okay, it's just a little bit better, a little bit more even. Still not perfect, right? And you can even see the tracking being applied to this line right here, but it's definitely a little bit better than what we had before. And you can see that with preview checked off, we're definitely getting some rivers in here. That's a pretty bad river right through there. But when I check it on, okay, just a little bit cleaner and not as many rivers. Okay, so that looks better. Let's go ahead and click OK. Okay, so this definitely looks better. There's also some rules around hyphenation that we can change. Okay, so if, again, in the paragraph panel, if I go down to hyphenation, which is going to bring up a dialog box for all the rules around hyphenation. So this is going to give us more control around how hyphenation works. Instead of just being able to turn it off or on, okay, we can also, get really specific around how long does a word have to be for it to be hyphenated, etc., etc. I really like to use this slider at the bottom, which makes it a little bit more simple. If we want fewer hyphens, okay, we can slide it over to fewer hyphens. And, in that case, InDesign is going to only use hyphenation where it's absolutely necessary. Or we can slide it over to better spacing, which is going to allow InDesign to be a little more liberal with its use of hyphens. You can see when I slide it over there, we're getting hyphens on a lot of lines here. It's almost like every other line, so that can get pretty distracting. So, where you slide this is up to you. In this case, I'm going to keep it kind of in the middle. And let's go ahead and click OK to apply that setting. Okay, and then one last thing I want to show you is, something that InDesign includes that is really useful for sort of verifying whether your spacing is working well. So I'm going to click W to turn our guides and grids back on. I don't want to be in that preview mode, because because what I'm going to show you is not going to work in that mode. Let's zoom in a little bit on our text. Okay, and then I'm going to go up to the top menu bar and go to Preferences and down to Composition. Okay, so under Composition, there's a few different things here. The one I want to check on is H and J violations. So this stands for hyphenation and justification violations. Okay, so I'm going to check that on and click OK. When I do that, some lines of text are going to highlight in yellow. In this case, it's actually just one line of text. Okay, and basically what it's telling me is that InDesign is not able to stick to our rules for this particular line. So for all these other lines, it's able to stick within those bounds that we created for it. Okay, but this line, it's not able to do that. So that line is giving it some problems. And you can see that that's definitely the case because that line is kind of messed up. There's a lot of tracking added. There's a lot of extra space between words. It just feels a little bit awkward compared to the other lines. Okay, so it's on us to make sure that those are fixed. One thing we can do is do a simple rewrite of the language. Okay, so in really bad situations, you may need to do this. A lot of times you're working with a copywriter to just do a really small rewrite, move one word over, something really simple in order to fix that issue. Another thing you do is add in some kind of discretionary hyphen. Okay, so you can see that this really long word is creating some issues here because, it's leaving this previous line with, fewer characters than what is normal. Okay, so maybe what we can do is, put a hyphen in here. The way to do that is to right-click in the text and go down to Insert Special Character and over to hyphens and dashes. And then we can go down to what's called a discretionary hyphen. So this is us putting in a hyphen that is extra to fix some letter spacing. So it's kind of like when we did the soft return to fix the widow. Okay, the discretionary hyphen is going to allow us to create an extra hyphen there, and in this case, fix that letter spacing issue that InDesign was having with that line of justified type. So now when I scroll down, you can see that there are no more yellow highlighted lines, and so we know that we're sort of within the rules that we created for InDesign. Doesn't guarantee that the spacing is perfect because we could create rules that are really extreme, and if we create rules that are really extreme, InDesign is going to have a easy time sticking to those rules, but doesn't mean that the text looks good. So up to you to make sure that it's looking good. And I can see that there are some issues here, like for instance, these few lines of text in here, like these 4 lines in a row, are really tight. Especially this line feels extremely tight. Okay, so that is definitely a little bit of an issue. I could definitely try sticking in a discretionary hyphen into here to see if that fixes it. Okay, in this case, even though I put in that discretionary hyphen, the paragraph composer decided that that wasn't a hyphen it wanted to put in. Okay, so maybe a rewrite would be necessary to fix that line of text, which again is just a little bit too extreme for me. It's creating, it looks like a traffic jam where everything's really squished in. Okay, so that might call for a little bit of an adjustment to the rules that we created around justification. Okay, so you can see that, justified type does look good, and when you work with, nice, neat columns of justified type, there is something really nice about it, that everything lines up. But the reason why a lot of times it's not used in our industry is because of all this extra work it creates. And if you don't put in the extra work, you're going to end up with really ugly justified type, which no one wants. It's always a nightmare to read that really bad justified type. One other thing that I'll point out, and let's scroll back up to our magazine interior, is that you can do all these settings inside of your paragraph styles. Okay, so if I wanted to apply justified type to my body here, what I could do is go to my paragraph style for my body copy. Okay, and inside of that window, I can go down to indents and spacing and change my alignment to left justify. Okay, you can see that that's going to implement that justified type style. And then I can go down to hyphenation to turn that on. This window is going to look exactly like that other window where we can slide this slider around or change these rules to do what we want to do. And then right under that we have justification, and this is where we can put in those rules around how the justification is going to be applied, including like the letter spacing and the glyph scaling and all that stuff. Okay, so, if I turn this off and on, you can see that it's applying all those styles. Still going to have to work to make sure I don't have any widows in there. Okay, so I'm already seeing that this change is implementing a few widows. So I'm going to have to go through there and fix that. And, I can also, hit W to see all of the violations that are happening in the justified space. You can see that there are quite a few in this case that aren't able to stick to what we gave to the composer. And there's different colors for how extreme those violations are. Okay, so the darker ones are a little more extreme than the ones that are a little lighter, which are just outside of the range. So again, up to you to make sure that that looks good. If you're using justified type, definitely put in the time to clean everything up to make sure it's readable and comfortable for whoever is looking at it.